All right, so to kick things off, could you introduce yourself?
My name's Dr. Noah Charney. I'm a professor of art history specializing in art crime.
That's amazing. You do this a lot. That was a perfect
Yeah,
soundbite.
yeah, yeah. I do TV presenting as well, so it's not my first rodeo.
Amazing. So, okay, so this video is largely about authenticity and the trade-offs that a lot of people make with um, willing to believe in a fantasy just because it's cool. So why do you think the public are so intrigued by counterfeit art?
The public fascination with authenticity and forgery has to do with the fact that we are fascinated with true crime and we like to cheer for Robin Hood figures. And these two elements come together in the world of forgery. Most art forgers are, I like to use the term, more prankster than gangster. They're criminals, but not the sort of criminal that people are really scared of, nor should they be. They're nonviolent criminals. They tend to not self-identify as criminals, and they tend to be very quirky Dickensian characters who you would quite like to go for a beer with. And what they're doing is pointing out that the emperor has no clothes on. And you can pick your analogy, but that's the one that seems most apt to me. The general public see them as pointing out that the art world is rather full of itself and probably shouldn't be. And so-called experts are easily fooled. And the concept of value, which feels very amorphous to the general public, is kind of silly, I think many people would say. And so they like it when somebody pops the balloon and breaks into what feels like an elitist private club. So there's also a social sort of caste system dynamic to it, where people who are of the non-elites within the art world feel like those silly fancy pants aristocratic art collectors are really very silly and should have their bubble burst.
I see. But are there any caveats to that then? Because I totally understand where that's coming from, but is there any room for harm with this enjoyment of the Robin Hood figure?
There are a lot of caveats to this Robin Hood view, and I think the way that the media, particularly the popular media, has portrayed forgers doesn't help the situation. In fact, if you talk to a lot of successful and then ultimately captured forgers, they're totally delighted that they had a criminal career and that they were caught, because it's one of the few crimes where it really does seem that crime pays. And why does it pay? Because most forgers are tried for the crime of fraud. Most countries don't have a crime called forgery. So these fraud crimes, you have to defraud someone out of something, which is usually money or sometimes a reputation. And you tend to go to jail for a very short amount of time. We're talking a year or two. And then when you come out, you're this celebrity because people think you're fascinating, which you may be, but the media really embraces forgers who have been caught and done their time and are now, you can see some of them with careers. They have their own TV shows. They get movies and books made out of their stories, and they're really enjoying themselves. There is damage that can be done, however, and that's something that people easily forget. So one of the things that is dangerous about forgers is that they can poison the well of historical information. Now, if you ask someone randomly on the street, are they worried about, our understanding of the creation of historical works of culture, if that concerns them, if it gets messed with in some way? And most people would probably say no. But if you're the sort of person who is concerned about this, then it's an issue of, for example, how would it be if suddenly a 10th symphony, supposedly by Beethoven, were discovered? And it was really lousy. And it would therefore damage our impression of the creator and force us to rewrite our history books, and it turns out it's fraudulent. Well, this can happen with forgery of works of art. It has happened in some cases that were very severe. We tend to think about it in terms of forgery of works of art that really don't damage beyond the immediate owner of the work and those who have gone out on a limb and said it's authentic when it's not. And it tends to not resonate because unlike other types of art crime, like art theft and antiquities looting, forgery tends to happen in more of a vacuum. Art theft and illicit trade in antiquities usually involves organized crime groups. And so whether or not you're worried about the art, if you don't like the idea of organized crime and the drug and arms trades and even terrorism, then it's something to take seriously. Most forgery cases involve one person or two people, which doesn't qualify as organized crime. And so it tends not to damage beyond the initial impact of the crime. However, there's some very prevalent examples that were incredibly damaging. And some of them were damaging because they promoted cultural phobias. One that comes to mind is called the Protocol of the Elders of Zion, which is an infamous forgery of a brochure that circulated in the 1910s that purported to report on secret knowledge of a combination Jewish Masonic plot to take over the world through economic means and undermine it. Now, this is proven to be entirely a forgery. Whole passages were taken from other texts and just pasted in, but people still believe this. And if you have an anti-Semitic or conspiracy theory vein in you, then people hop on this same forgery and ride with it. So that's something that, you know, is a forgery proven as such that people choose not to believe is a forgery that has actually led to, you know, racism, anti-Semitism, and violence. So that's one of the other sides of it. Then we have incidents where historical archives can be damaged in a way that runs a double risk. And I'll give you a case study. The story of John Myatt and John Drew is one of the important case studies in the history of forgery. John Myatt was a forger. He wasn't really someone who you'd identify as a criminal. He was a father, a single father. He was a school teacher. He couldn't make ends meet, and you could hire him. He advertised in a magazine that he would create what he called genuine fakes, which are works in the style of another artist that he would create for you and cost you £100 or something like that. And a man named John Drew bought a couple of them and then called him up one day and said, "I've sold your paintings as originals. Do you want to go into business?" John Drew was the front man, and the way their approach to this forgery scheme worked was that Myatt would create works in the style of famous artists. He wouldn't copy an existing work because that's very suspicious immediately. He would create a work that appeared to be in the style of an artist but wasn't in any historical record. And then John Drew would forge historical documents like a gallery notice or a contract or a letter that refers to the work, and he smuggled them into real archives, including the National Archives at Kew Gardens in London and the V&A Museum archives. And the problem was that as soon as we know that real archives have been polluted with forged documents, there's a double danger. One is that scholars will go to the archive, assume that everything has been checked, and will believe a fake piece of historical information. But even worse, if we know that an archive has been breached by a forger, we might not believe real historical documents. Gotcha. So there's two sides to it. The second one is more devastating because all of a sudden we might start questioning the entire archive and wondering if it's forgery, and then we really get into trouble. So from a historical point of view and from the point of view of cultural heritage and intellectual property, it's easy to argue that you should be concerned about this, but most people don't get too worried about that. But for the general people on the street, there have been very misleading forgeries that have caused violence and political unrest, and that makes it feel more visceral and serious to your average man on the street.
Understood. So a follow-up question to that then is, do you think that we should be, so the tagline of your book, The Art of Forgery, is "The world wishes to be deceived, so let it be deceived." Do you think that we actually should want that though? Like, should we be pleased with just having a pretty picture and existing in this fantasy? Or is there any downside to just not knowing whether the thing in front of you is what it claims to be?
So this is a great question for this day and age, because we seem to be a world populace that is delighted with fake news if it fits our own agenda. So you can extrapolate as much as you like. When I was writing about this, I was writing about cultural heritage objects, mostly works of art. And in that sense, I guess it's about the depth of your belief. The example that I gave, among many, was I created this equation that roughly gives a sense of the value of art, and the value of art equals perceived rarity plus perceived authenticity plus perceived demand. So it's all about perception, and if you believe that an object is in high demand, is rare or unique, and is authentic, then its value is as if it is, whether it is or not. And an example is in the case of the Wakker-Van Gogh trials in Amsterdam in the 1930s, which was the earliest trial to use forensic evidence to solve an art-related case. A man named Chester Dale, who was a wealthy American collector, had a painting that was supposedly by Van Gogh that was identified as a forgery made by the Wakker family. And he went public and said, as long as I'm alive, this is by Van Gogh. And he even sued the head of a Dutch museum for, I think it was 1 cent or was it 10 cents, something entirely symbolic, for having said that it's a forgery. He didn't need any money. He wanted just to have it on the record that this guy had said it was a forgery and he had to take it back. It was a forgery by any objective stretch of the imagination. But the fact is that people will believe what they want to believe. Maybe the most famous example is the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin was demonstrated as a forgery in the 1980s by 4 independent labs, all of which identified this famous religious relic as having been a medieval painting. And as early as the 14th century, so within decades of it having been brought to France from the Holy Land by a French knight named Geoffrey de Charney, probably no relation, it was denounced as a forgery by a bishop. So this was not fooling anybody, but millions of people every year go to it and venerate it as a religious relic. So, you know, the strength of human belief is stronger than objective science. So I think we really, especially in this day and age where fake news that if anyone bothered to check is easy to see is fake because it circulates so easily. I think we have internet and social media to blame that people who want to believe what they want to believe will find fellow souls, and then you get these echo chambers where people genuinely believe things are real that by any objective measure are easy to see or not. And so that's where this study of the history of art forgery can be extrapolated and applied to things unrelated to art but related to daily life.
Understood. I suppose those were the hard questions out of the way. The hard, even though you answered them incredibly. But in terms of like the easier questions, these have to do with more of definitions that I've come across that I think people who are outside of the art study world just would confuse them. First off, provenance. What is it?
Provenance is the term for the documented history of an object. So it could take lots of different forms. It could be a receipt or a contract for the commission of an artwork. It could be a photograph where the object in question is seen in the photograph. It could be a letter where somebody says, I saw this painting the other day. So anything that is historical reference to the object.
Gotcha. And then in extension to that, in the art of forgery, you mentioned how authentic works can be used to in a greater scheme of deception. But what is an authentic work in this context? How is that not a fraud or a fake?
So it depends on which case study you're thinking of. There are, well, maybe it's easiest to answer. Most people use the terms fake and forgery interchangeably, but in fact, from a criminological perspective, they're different things. A forgery is a work created from scratch in fraudulent imitation of something else. A fake is an object that already existed that is altered in some way to make it seem more valuable. So if you have an authentic object and it looks a little bit like a painting by Picasso, and you think it would look more like a painting by Picasso if you just added his signature to it, that's a fake. If you go to the hardware store and get some canvas and some paint and make something that's meant to be a Picasso, that's a forgery.
Gotcha. Oh, that really clears things up quite quickly. And yeah, I suppose that's the bulk of my questions. Just a fun one to throw your way, though. What is your favorite piece of art?
I get asked this question a lot, and I have an answer that I could talk about for hours, but I'll spare you. It's Bronzino's Allegory of Love and Lust, which is a painting from 1545 that's in the National Gallery in London. And this was the subject of one of my master's theses. And it just fascinates me. I've stared at it for endless hours in person, and it's hung in a poster in my dorm room for my entire time as a student. And it's a visual puzzle that nobody has definitively solved, but we have a pretty good indication of it now. But I like pictures that are meant to be visual riddles. And you need a certain amount of a priori knowledge to crack them. But there's no definitive answer. It's not like mathematics, and so it's more like philosophy. And there you can let your imagination fly, but within the context of real historical information, and see what you can come up with. And I really like those puzzles.
That's very fun. And I think it works well with the fact that you enjoy crooked bookshelves as well.
Yes, indeed, absolutely.
All right. And that is all of my questions. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me
Oh,
today.
it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.